Here's Brody Brazil.
You know, here in 2025, I'm finding it very easy to distinguish between what is considered old sports media and what is new sports media. There's like a hard line being drawn in the sand, and you're either one or the other in terms of who you are, how you operate, and what you present to an audience. Now, more on personalities in just a second, but I think what I've represented here graphically makes a lot of sense. Chris Mad Dog Russo on the left, and all he's done in his career over the decades, that kind of embodies old sports media. He's been on television, he's been on radio, and that pretty much has been it for most of his career. And then there's Draymond Green, who, is he actually in media yet? I mean, I think we all realize he will be full-time someday, but right now he's still a professional athlete, but he's dipping his toes into new media. In fact, he uses that term, new media, all the time. And I could not agree with Draymond Green more. There is a thing surrounding new media. It's different. It has a different approach. It has a different goal and end game, and it is kind of taking over what most of you are watching. And yeah, I, of course, am saying this to you on a new media platform. So obviously, you're in on new media. The point of this video is going to be to kind of compare and contrast, and we'll get to that in just a second. But I also feel like I need some disclaimers here, things I need to say before anything else. I'm somebody that came up in old media. I was born and raised on old media in the late 90s and early 2000s when I entered the workforce. And so I'm not sitting here saying that if you're stuck in old media, it's not entirely the worst thing to be established in old media. Like, that's what you've done. You've carved a nice career for yourself, and old media probably takes care of you. It's not a bad thing to be established or labeled as an old media type person. If you're still doing it and it's going strong, great for you. I mean, the business is changing, but again, there's nothing bad about being a legend of old media. And I'm also not here to label anybody as saying, well, that's an old media type person or that's a new media type person. None of this really has anything to do with age or that type of demographic of the actual personality involved. It's more about their approach and the things they do and the places they do them in. And I'm talking about delivering sports content here. So it's more about the places you operate than necessarily the person that you are, although there is some correlation to that too. Anybody with industry experience, like I just said, right now, anybody with 10, 20 years of doing media, of course, they're just like me. They came from the old media days. And so this is kind of a switch. This is a transition into a lot of new things and ways we never used to do it, ways we'll do it now, though, because it's kind of what the audience is craving. So let's talk about old media here. And the definition for me of old media is mainly this: platforms and formats that existed before 2010. Now, I just picked that year. I think I could have said 2015 or 16 because I feel like that's really when podcasts and having a show with a long-form guest started to appear a lot more. But I'll just say 2010. That was kind of the emergence of social platforms. Old media looks like this. So yeah, mostly stuff before 2010. That started before 2010, but it usually operates on precise show timing, like the clock, and there's also kind of a formulaic presentation. What do I mean by show timing? Well, the show starts at 12 noon, and it goes off the air at 12:28:00, and it takes a commercial break at 5 minutes and 15 seconds in, and another one at 7 minutes and 45 seconds, and there's a 4-segment show. Like, it's very formatted in terms of its timing and also its presentation. Like, here's the first segment. Here's what we'd always do in the first segment. Here's the second segment. Here's how the show starts. Here's how it ends. Old media is very formulaic, as opposed to this. I've been recording for 3 minutes, and I don't know how long this is going to go, but there's no real clock against what I'm doing here. Old media, you're operating on the clock. Usually old media is found in one place. There's rarely ever a comments section. Like, if you're watching the evening news, you can't comment back to what you're watching on television. And old media, I'll be honest, is currently struggling. And when I say less common, there's less old media out there now than there ever used to be 15, 20 years ago. But you're also not seeing a bunch of new old media type programs emerge. If somebody's doing something new, it's not necessarily for old media. It's going to be part of new media, which we'll get into in a second. Some obvious examples, and yeah, I've used Chris Mad Dog Russo there, the radio show, like a sports radio. Now that has evolved. They're bringing sports radio onto platforms like X and Twitch and YouTube, and that kind of makes it more of a new media format, which I think is great for the platform of sports radio. But newspapers as a physical hold it in your hand medium, yeah, that's old media. SportsCenter as a show. and the way that it operates on linear television. That is old media. And I would still love SportsCenter. I don't watch a lot of it. I don't know that a lot of people watch it the same way they used to because they're seeing their highlights and they're getting it from other places. But SportsCenter is a prime example of old media. And there's a bunch of other examples, but those are three obvious ones for me. New media, let's go to the other side of the table here, often doesn't carry top-notch production value. Like old media cared about how things look. And I mean, like I said, I came up in old media. That's why I tried to make a home studio that looks professional and presentable and all that. That's kind of my old media background. But new media, I mean, you don't need all of this. You could have somebody with a bookshelf or their unmade bed in the background. You'll still watch it if the presenter and the information and the product is what you were hoping to tune in for. But new media doesn't always carry top-notch production value. New media also doesn't take routine breaks in the program like, oh, wait, gotta pause. We'll be back right after this. We don't do that here. On a YouTube channel, on a live stream, on any type of new media program, on a Netflix show, it just doesn't happen. So no breaks in the program. You can time it out for as short or as long as you think you need it to be. New media is typically found in multiple places. Like, hey, you can listen to our podcast on 27 different platforms, also on YouTube. It's a more available product than, hey, our one show airs at this time on this channel, and if you miss it, you missed it. Might be on demand, but new media is everywhere. And also in new media, I would say that the hosts are more real and a little bit broadcasty. What do I mean by a little less broadcasty? I mean that on new media, we don't always talk like this as a television presenter, and I'm not wearing a suit and tie. I'm not formally dressed. Like hosts and presenters are a lot more real on new media. It doesn't really matter where you are. I'd rather see you in a real life moment on new media than I would in a traditional, expected, buttoned up, very stiff kind of way on old media. So there is kind of that expectation. Here's some examples of new media. I mentioned Draymond Green, his podcast that now Baron Davis has joined in and become a part of. Like, that's great. That's a player. After he does the podium interviews, then he goes home and says, well, here's what I really want to say. Here's my opinion on our team, the league, different situations, talk to Baron about stuff. So that's an example of new media. The Hockey Guy, friend of the channel, The Hockey Guy. I can't wait to do some more collaborations with him. I mean, there's somebody who is a fan of sports, who started a YouTube channel, has 300,000+ subscribers now. I mean, that is an example of new media. Videos daily, multiple videos daily, reacting to things. He doesn't have a channel. He doesn't have a time. I mean, he does put out videos regularly, but the point is he can do whatever he wants. That's new media. Stephen A. Smith is somebody who came up in old media, but has now jumped to new media. He's got his own show. Look at the background. Yeah, it looks professional, and he's got kind of the same thing I do, right? Like, he comes from something else, so he's making the transition, but his topics and his presentation, totally different on new media than he is on old traditional media. And then the Kelsey brothers, right? Now, there's an example if you also think about maybe a Pat McAfee who is doing a new media show that old media, ESPN, said, hey, we'll take your new media show and put it on our old media and see how it works. But the Kelsey brothers, 20 years ago, would you have ever thought that two athletes, in the case one retired, one active, and by the way, now Eagles and Chiefs in the Super Bowl, imagine what these upcoming episodes are going to be like. The point is, 20 years ago, that wasn't a thing. There was no space. There was no place for that. And now they can do it from their homes. They can do it easy. They can talk about exactly whatever they want. Okay, if you still don't get old versus new media, I've got a couple very contrasting examples here for you. Old media. So after a game and something happens and a player says something about this situation, media will interpret the player interviews and the comments into their own reports. Well, here's what Draymond Green said after the Warriors, fourth straight loss or not making the playoffs or whatever. Now we'll talk about it on our show. Now we'll print it in the newspaper. That's old media. New media, Draymond Green goes home, grabs a mic, turns it on, hits record, connects with Baron Davis. Players say whatever they want in their own words. They ask themselves the questions that they want to be asked. It's totally unfiltered on their own podcast. You don't need to get their answers from a network. They kind of are the network in new media. Here's another example. Old media, a little bit more protective of integrity and dignity and maybe professionalism and responsibility, accountability, I guess is what I'm trying to say here. On traditional broadcast platforms, if you say something that's either inaccurate or inappropriate, there are repercussions. You could get in trouble. Your network could get in trouble. You could get sued. In new media, it kind of feels like, well, everybody knows that the media cycle, like attention towards something, it's not going to last for more than 48 hours on any one given topic. So it's just going to kind of go away. And I don't know that new media is less responsible, but it certainly doesn't approach things with the same, level of care and compassion, it feels like. And maybe that's a downside to new media. Old media can find itself immune, though, to feedback and comments and praise and opposition. And trust me, I'm somebody who, when I first started doing television, I put my email address out on the screen. There was no social media in the early 2000s, or at least certainly not of a popular degree. So the only feedback I got was when somebody dared to write an email to Brody@kicu.com. We'd put it on the screen. But that was it. That was the only way to get any kind of feedback, and people weren't watching that show out of the state or nationally or globally. But now here on new media, anybody from across the world, right below the video, can put in the comments section whatever they feel like, whether it's praise, whether it's criticism, whether it's appropriate, whether it's totally inappropriate, whether it's relevant or not. New media has no choice but to at least observe the comments and the two-way communication that's happening on those platforms. Old media's got another trend that a lot of people are aware of, that they're cutting back on popular and long-standing programs and personalities and presenters that you've come to know for 10, 15, 20 years in a show that you've religiously watched for a long time. And now it's just being canceled because there's not an audience anymore, or the sponsors aren't there. And we'll get to the segmentation of the audience in just a second that new media is causing for old media, but it's as simple as that. Old media is not the same as it used to be in its wealth and its diverse range of programming. New media, however, is trying old friends, like it's bringing some people from old media to new media, but it's also trying brand new people on new places and roles and platforms and situations. So new media is kind of like, hey, we don't have this very rigid structure. We'll try anything. And if it works, great, and we'll give it time, but we're not as stuffy as old media. We're a little bit more flexible. Old media typically presents and originates from a traditional broadcast studio. There's an anchor desk and there's all the things you would expect to see. Well, I guess colored background and stuff like that. But yeah, it looks a lot like that. New media is usually somebody at their home or in a one-person studio or talking head location. Kind of like where I'm at right now. You see here how I've tried to take old media and bring it to new media just a little bit. But yeah, new media and what you'd expect to see like literally on screen is a lot different from old media to new media, typically across the board. And I think this might be the last one. Yeah, old media, when you look at breaking news coverage, if something is happening right now, like in the NFL, if there's a big football story or piece of news, now on ESPN they might break into coverage, but back in the day, if there wasn't an NFL show until later on in the afternoon, you didn't really get that news until later on in the afternoon. Breaking news coverage couldn't really take place until the next scheduled edition of that program took place. On new media, there's an emergency podcast that people do. There's a social media, obviously. It gets covered instantly. And if you missed it, you missed it. And nobody's going to wait around several hours to hear about it anymore. New media has kind of taken control because you can put out content and episodes at a moment's notice. So here are my takeaways. And this is hard to put this all into one conversation and digest all of this. Thanks for sticking around, by the way, to the end of this video. Old media was familiar and stable for so many decades. Sports media didn't really change from the 80s to the 90s into the 2000s, but in the 2010s, it drastically changed. And what people got comfortable with was, and if you're watching it or working in it, it was kind of like the rug got pulled out from underneath you. Audience segmentation is what became trouble for ratings-based revenue of old media. When I say that, it's that all of a sudden there weren't just 10 programs to watch on linear television or traditional media outlets. There's 100 things to watch. There's 1,000 different things to watch on YouTube channels, social media, streaming platforms. Like all these different eyeballs and ears are going 100 different places. They used to just go 10 places. So that created high viewing amounts. And now it got so spread out, it got so segmented that old media and traditional media, it has a hard time keeping up with all the new places that people are going. And I think the phone, honestly, the phone dramatically changed. I don't know why I had to grab it to show you. You know what a phone looks like. But this in our hands constantly totally changed the expectations of sports media, the instant nature of sports media. You're riding the bus. Well, there's no TV, but I've got this phone, or I can listen to a podcast in the car. All these things, they actually create the audience to go even bigger and higher, but it's being spread out. And so old media suffers from that. New media is growing exponentially. And I think even while it's raw and unpolished, and a lot of times you're like, I can't believe that they're letting people see this. It's not like what old media used to be. It's not as professional looking. That doesn't matter. People don't seem to care as much. So even raw and unpolished, and even when it's not fully figured out, like there's not expectations specifically for new media, it's still growing and doing quite well. And let me just state this from somebody who worked for a lot of years in old media and kind of tried to transition away from it and get into some new media. And now my current job is new media. And I don't know if the opportunity will ever even present itself that I go back to a traditional type broadcast platform. I don't know. If something great happens, okay, we'll think about it. But I would say the expectation is for a lot of people, once you've exited working in old media, you may never go back to it, whether you want to or even have the chance to. It's scary times in a sense that we're saying goodbye to something, kind of, or it's diminishing, or it's lesser, or it's going away, but it's also exciting times because it presents so many new opportunities on the horizon. And if you are somebody who's creative and forward-thinking and opportunistic, like Draymond Green, then yeah, new media, it's going to treat you just fine. So hopefully that was a lot to dive into, a lot to chew on there, but hopefully some of that made sense from my perspective. Let me know what you think down there in the comments. Since this is new media, do you agree with what I said? Was I close or accurate? Also, thumbs up down there helps me, this video, this channel. And don't forget to subscribe down there so I can definitely see you back here next time.